in Missouri, it's not that we have bad charters, we have a bad charter law. And that law was, in my mind, meant to dismantle a couple school districts on purpose, right? And it was a way to kind of break them. And there was no intentionality about learning best practice from others and then infusing those best practices into these schools. And then it became just a competition for resources at that point instead of a collaboration.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is former Springfield Public Schools Superintendent John Jungmann. Although still a relatively young man, John had been recognized as one of Missouri's top educators. During his tenure as the superintendent here in Springfield, he presided over the largest bond issue in the history of Springfield Public Schools. Among other accolades, in 2016 he was named Missouri Superintendent of the Year, in part because of his work in online learning. He has also been recognized by the Missouri School Public Relations Association, and Governor Parson has named him as Missouri's representative on the Education Commission of the states. He is well familiar with all aspects of operating public school systems in Missouri, from large to small, starting his career as a high school teacher in his hometown of Lamar, and then progressing from there to higher roles in Monette and Liberty before becoming Springfield Superintendent in 2014. Since leaving SBS in 2021, he has operated his own consulting firm, and he's here today to give his views on the state of public education in Missouri. John, welcome to In Our Town.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
I'm glad to. Did I get that right?
It's close enough. I think you nailed most of it.
All right, fine.
It sounds much better than I actually am there, but it's been fun.
Well, good. So tell us, what are you doing now?
A lot of education consulting. So, education is my heart. It has been my career for 25 years. Once I left Lamar and graduated and came back and started teaching, I've always had a passion to help kids in some way. So now I do that through adults, basically. I do a lot of coaching of superintendents and help with our state association. I do some finance consulting, but both statewide and nationally try to engage with school leaders to try to help them be successful in their work.
There's got to be some common issues you run into in dealing with the concerns of the people you're working with. Name two or three of them.
Some of the biggest hot issues right now, number one, is just human resources. Having enough highly qualified people in any position to run schools. From the classroom, number one, to support positions, to leadership positions. The massive turnover that we've had in the last few years, and you couple that with high demand in a lot of other workforce areas. People have a lot of different options. And then you double on, Tom, what I would call the second hot button issue is just the level of politics that have raised their head in public education has kept a lot of people from wanting to be in the classroom and be in school leadership, and they're making other choices. So it's really hard to run schools right now.
Is it this kind of left-wing, right-wing divide?
I think it's become more divisive, right? It's certainly in my career. When I started as a high school teacher, that was never even a conversation, right? When I was a high school English teacher of what we should be teaching in that classroom. Our local school board was highly engaged with our school leaders and our community. And that was taken care of at the very local level and never had any issues. And then, time changed. When I got to the superintendency, still wasn't anything like that. Communities were very united around their public education environments.
To your point, I'm quite a bit older than you are, but when I was going to high school, Willard Graff was a superintendent. Yep. And basically, my sense was he was a benevolent dictator. And I knew Arthur Mallory's dad, Dillard Mallory, at Buffalo. Yeah. And those guys were held on a pedestal. The idea of really challenging them was foreign to the citizens and certainly to the superintendent as well. Why did we go from there to here, do you think?
It's been such a weird transformation. It's real, and I think it's really happened primarily in the last 5-6 years. Because my career as a superintendent, spanned 13 years, and until my last 5, I didn't see that. I mean, there was always issues. You'd have struggles. You're running large organizations with highly emotional topics around your kids, right? And your tax dollars, 2 things that people have opinions about. Mm-hmm. But we always could come to some kind of agreement around what was best and move forward. But in the last 5 years, the political divide, as well as, throw COVID in there in the pandemic, and everybody's sentences got heightened to a level, and disagreement became the norm instead of agreement and collaboration around solutions. And that's made it really hard for school leaders and teachers that used to be held on pedestals to want to go into the field right now.
Without taking sides on particular issues, I think we'd all agree here in Springfield, for example, we have a divided board.
Right. And that's not unique to Springfield. I mean, I would tell you that's
good point.
Nationally, as I work with other people in different regions, it's more than it's ever been, for sure, more divided boards than it's ever been, but it's not unique to us. Unfortunately, it's a national phenomenon.
But I hear you saying that in addition to that, you're getting pushback from the teachers and the administrators as well.
Well, yeah, and just not wanting to do the work. I mean, not wanting to show up because of so much controversy that's just battled around schools, right? There's a lot of adult issues that are creating, a place that it's not what you got in the work for, right? Which is to see kids succeed, right? It becomes a lot of adult political issues, and that's made it really hard for educators to stay in, honestly. They're choosing other fields because there are other economic opportunities.
I did a little reading on this, and you can tell me whether it's accurate or not, but what I read was that there's roughly, 800,000 plus students in Missouri. The number of teachers hasn't gone down so much, except I think they said like in 5 school districts. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure which those are. Yeah. My sense was the teacher-to-student ratio hasn't really gotten worse.
No, I don't think that's happened. I think what has changed is the pool of applicants that you have for each one of those positions. Okay. So we're still filling those, but often we're filling those positions with non-certificated teachers now. Mm-hmm. And where it used to be, I'll just tell you, when I first came here, we'd have hundreds of applicants for elementary positions. I don't think that's the case anymore. When I go visit school districts all across our state and talk to them, they look to hire immediately now, right? You don't wait until the traditional hiring season. If you see somebody, you grab them as quickly as possible, because you may not have a way to fill that position with a certificated person that has a degree and has the training. So it means you're going on and getting a non-certificated person, still filling the position, to your point, but not with the same level of experience, and certainly with the not same level of training.
I hear you saying it's not so much the pay as it is to the environment in which they're having to teach.
I think it's a double-edged sword there. Certainly environment and culture, of the community and of the school systems, right? Accreditation systems, all the accountability structures, all of those things play into the effect of the environment that a teacher's teaching in. But a significant factor is the economics of it, right? Especially for Missouri teachers, where, we saw Arkansas just not too long ago work hard to move their starting salaries to $50,000 or above. And Missouri's done a few little things to move teacher salaries up, but we're still lagging significantly around our neighboring states.
The law is in Missouri, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert, and that's why you're here today. But there's not a lot of latitude on how you pay particular teachers. So it's basically, this is what you get paid, and you get more money based upon whether you have a higher degree and tenure.
Well, I wouldn't say there's not latitude. What is required is that you have to pay them based on a schedule. Okay, but that schedule is determined by your local board, right? That is not a state schedule. Now, there are some state minimums that are requirements, but most people are well beyond those minimums.
Okay.
But then you can choose to run your schedule how you want. If you want to do it on years of service and education experience, that's fine. If you want to do it on something else, you can also. But almost everybody runs it on a very traditional structure. Years of service and educational attainment are the 2 factors that allow you to move on the schedule and get placed on a schedule.
Okay, so I've always been just a small businessman, kind of shopkeeper type mentality. And in my world, in the private sector, if somebody was doing a great job and doing a better job than the person next to him, you'd pay them more money.
Right.
And I can't think of anything that I think is more important in giving young people a great education.
100%.
And why shouldn't we pay teachers based upon performance rather than essentially, it sounds a whole lot like a union job to me.
Well, number one, I would agree we need to pay them more, and especially ones that do incredible jobs. The hardest thing with performance pay systems, and those have been tried across our country over and over again in lots of different states, and it's actually been brought up here multiple times. And there is some flexibility that districts can do a few little things around that area, but it becomes really hard to determine what are you going to pay on, right? Is it a state assessment score? Is it parent feedback? Is it just your evaluation? Or is it something else? Or is it your grade? How the students perform? Well, the teacher controls the grades.
Well, as a private businessman, I would say, okay, these kids that are starting in the third grade should be reading at fourth grade level. The next year. Let's test them where they are, test them where they end up, compare how this teacher does to other teachers, and if somebody has a particular gift for it, why is it got to be more complicated than that?
If all the inputs were equal, that would work perfect. Right.
Okay.
But unfortunately, when students enter our schools, they don't enter on grade level. They come with lots of different potential challenges.
Absolutely.
Right? And to assume that every teacher can grow every kid the same amount and get them to the same spot is not understanding
realistic.
Human nature, right? Or
well, that's my whole point. So
right,
the persons that can move the needle more, why don't we pay them more?
Yeah, and I'm 100% with trying to find those best practice people and incentivize them to continue to do good work. But the others, right, the other teachers are still going to have to serve a student population, and we've got to figure out a way to serve that student population. And if you only incent those that are in a growing situation, well, advantaged populations, advantaged communities that have more resources typically win in those factors, right? And it leaves, unfortunately, some of the students that need the most help with some of the poorest educators, unfortunately.
Well, I made my point.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. It's the whole point is it's a very complex issue. Right.
Yeah.
And business practices, which I'm a believer in some great business practices in running schools, but they don't easily translate to sometimes to public goods, right, that everybody needs to benefit from and that everybody comes in on very different levels.
Mm-hmm. What is the most critical time to address learning issues? Early childhood?
100%. All research tells us from birth on, actually prior to birth, right, there are ways to be doing things that will help make sure that the child is ready, right? Because premature birth, we know, has delayed learning effects potentially. So early as you possibly can. And that's why, in Springfield, we were huge advocates of early childhood education, expanded early childhood. The state has actually done a nice job. I do believe it's one of the pride points I have in Missouri is they're aggressively trying to do more work for early childhood education. It's now part of the formula. And when I say formula, it's a funding structure that school districts can expand the number of seats. We're able to add early childhood centers here to do that. But the more that you can invest in the early stages to kind of fix any learning issues or to lessen gaps at that point, it's the best dollar you've spent in education.
When does the school kick in on that? Is it 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, so traditionally it'd be around 5 or 6 is kindergarten, but then there are formulas that allow for a percentage of students that are in high need situations to be able to get early childhood education. So it's not universal quite yet in Missouri, but it certainly is accessible for some students with high needs.
Do you feel that there is pretty wide acceptance of the importance of early childhood education now?
I feel like it is. I feel like
it's kicked in about 15 years ago.
Yeah, there's still people that believe that that's not going to solve the problems. It's not going to solve everything. We're not saying that, but it's a great investment in a community and into the life of a student. And the more that we can expand that, I think most people are in agreement with that now. That's not a highly controversial issue.
What about parent involvement? How would you compare, particularly at the elementary level, how would you compare the degree of parent involvement today to what it was 10 years ago or maybe more?
I think it's still high in areas, and then it's on steroids in some other areas, right? But early childhood, elementary schools, it's never been a high struggle to get parents involved in certain areas, right? Where economics are strong, where, they have a good history and track record with education or public education or their experience in school. Typically, parent involvement's high. When you have lower SES, and that's socioeconomic status, buzzword in education, it's how we classify free and reduced rates is what we're talking about. But typically, and no different in Springfield than it was in Liberty and Monette, when you had higher SES schools, you had lower parent involvement. And we don't know exactly why, right? Because I don't know if parents don't have as much confidence walking into the educational environment as other parents do in that scenario, or if they're highly engaged in work, right? That's keeping them from being able to do that. But traditionally, higher SES environments, you're going to have parent involvement through the roof, as well as PTOs and PTAs and fundraising, and then lower or higher SES populations, percentages, then parent involvement seems to slide off a bit.
Well, my guess would be, and I could certainly be off base, but if you're looking at what I'll just call poor kids, there's a greater preponderance of them that come from single parent families.
Agreed.
And whether it's mom or dad, he or she is having to work more. If they're not coming from a two-parent family, you don't have somebody that can find the time to be involved.
Exactly right. Just other priorities take precedent at that point, and then those schools may not have that same level of engagement from families.
In the main or the aggregate, how are students in Missouri performing, if you were going to judge them by test scores now, as what they were, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago?
I would say, and I don't have the data in front of me, and unfortunately what we see is that we've changed tests multiple times. We've changed our accreditation system. So it's hard to compare year over year
It's
over year.
apples and oranges.
I would say if you looked at NAEP, which is what most people look at as the kind of the golden standard, that's the only test that actually goes across 50 states.
Now, what's that?
NAEP, NAEP, National Education Performance Assessment of some sort. And it's gone back for a long time. And NAEP scores have been relatively flat, I think, historically. Maybe gradually went up, flattened out a little bit, but they compare like 3rd and 8th grade reading and math across all 50 states.
Oh, well, that's interesting because I had the sense that we weren't doing as well, but you don't think that's
I think it's probably not going down, but it's not escalating. And I'm talking over decades of trend, right? But what you see in some of your state scores, it's hard to interpret with accreditation score because you're throwing in a number of different factors, right? You're throwing in student assessment, you're talking in growth, you're talking in just what they call status achievement, and then you're throwing in a number of other factors, graduation, you're throwing in college readiness. There's a number of different factors.
That sounds to me like a lot of subjectivity.
Some of it is subjective, but a lot of those come down to a hard number.
Do they? Okay.
Yeah, they do, and come down to a measurement, and they are ranked on a scale of some sort that the state uses in order to create a accreditation number. Unfortunately, what we've seen is those scoring systems change over the years, so it's really hard to say, all right, let's look at 10 years of accreditation data. It's not going to tell you anything, honestly, because you're going to see the scores fluctuate. And honestly, some of the factors has been political. It's a little political football because the state has mandated, that you can't use this score, you shouldn't use this score, you need to change this. And then DESE has to respond and, change the structures, which puts schools responding to DESE's change in structures, which makes it really difficult to get anything consistent over time.
I'm sure you're familiar. In the accounting world, they have what they call generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. And the idea is we don't really care how you do this, but you got to keep doing it the same way.
So we can at least know from year to year if the books look right.
Right.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the education system, for whatever reasons, the aggregate's not following GAAP.
I would say we struggle with that.
Yeah.
Right? Well, we may have curriculum consistency over time, but certainly our testing structures and our accreditation monitoring and those things have kind of shifted with the winds a little bit.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, I'm Ryan Collins. I'm the Business and Economic Development reporter at the Springfield Daily Citizen. Pretty much born and raised in Springfield. I went to Glendale High School. I graduated from the University of Missouri with degrees in journalism and economics, hired directly by Bloomberg News right after college. It's been very refreshing to come back to Springfield, report on the city. think one of the best aspects of my job is just being in the know. I'm constantly in touch with people all across different types of companies. And I think we have a lot of moving parts right now that are trying to work together, and I feel very lucky to try to cover that. After my week, I spend time with my dog. I definitely try to get out in nature. We go out to Busick or somewhere like that. Nash. He's named after my favorite economist, John Nash.
My sense is if you were to compare the United States to other first world countries, we are not keeping up with those countries in many areas, particularly in the STEM sciences,
Right.
science, technology, what is the other one?
Engineering and math.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is that true?
And again, I think it's how you look at it. If you just look at a pure ranking on our NAEP scores or our international scores, and I think ISTE or some other, acronym that they use to compare some of those things, we wouldn't be in the top 10, right? I mean, and we're not closing the gap on other nations.
But we're
typically.
spending as much as they are, aren't we, generally?
I think in general you would see that. I think some of the things that you do see are student population differences, right?
Okay.
When you talk about economic status of kids, some of the things that you just brought in, dual income, single family parent situations, the diversity of our student population, if you think about how it is continuing to change, and that happens in Springfield, and it's something that I think, as Americans, we're typically proud of serving all kids, right, as they come into
Right.
our schools. And no matter where you came from or what disadvantage you may come with, we will bring you in and we will work as hard as we can.
Well, I think many historians would agree one of the main things that made us such a prosperous country was our public education system.
Exactly right. And I think it's still a pride point. And I think the majority of Americans still think that is the case. Traditionally, when you look at, I think it's Phi Delta Kappa that does an annual review and asks them, how is your local public school doing? And they grade it well, typically ABs. But then when they say public education in general, right, it's typically graded lower, right? Because what we hear, right, and what we see in the media makes us a little suspect of the performance, but our local experience with our local educator and our local principal or our local teacher is typically pretty strong. So I think if you use that as a metric, people feel good about public education, but when we get to some of the national metrics, we certainly have room for improvement. But we also should take pride in the fact that we serve every kid, and we take pride in the fact that as they come into our country, we will take them with whatever they bring to the table, whether that's no language skills, right, which we happen all the time, right? And we will do the best we can to get them on grade level as quickly as possible so that they're a productive member of our society.
So the number of students in Missouri is lower than what it was 10 years ago. And I've heard two things. You tell me to what extent they're true, that there's sort of a demographic cliff and there's just fewer kids. But the other thing is less confidence by some people in their public school system. So they're going, I guess, either the private school route or homeschooling.
Sure.
Is that true?
So number one, I think population maybe dips a little bit. I would have to look at the number of 10 over, but I know during the pandemic we had a dip in public enrollment. That has recovered some, but I don't think it's back to pre-pandemic levels. And then I think to your other point that the replacement cycle for kids versus the number of kids that your family had and my family had, last of 6, is not the typical replacement cycle that we have right now.
That's true.
So population in general, I think, is bubbling in the middles, right? And it's smaller at the K-12 level than it was nationally right now. But all that being said, certainly, I think there are more people choosing homeschool and choosing private education than there were in the past. And I think that's a number of factors, right? There's a lot of political winds that have created a lot of controversy around what's going on in public education and a lot of skepticism that I don't think is deserved on a lot of fronts. But I don't ever tell anybody they shouldn't homeschool their kid or not go to private school. If they think that's what's the best environment for them, then I would say go for it.
In the aggregate, are those kids doing as well as the kids in public school systems?
I think it's comparable, right? If you're comparing apples to apples on socioeconomic status and giving us all the same factors, I don't think you're going to see a big difference in the actual data of performance of students if you're actually comparing like populations.
Okay. I always thought, though, one of the things that was very valuable about public school education is just exposure to a whole wide range of different people from different walks of life. And it'd be really easy to have sort of a silo view of the world if you're never exposed to much of anybody else.
Well, and that's why my kids go to public school, and I will always choose that for them. And I value it for the schools that we ran here in Springfield and across the state of Missouri. It is the place where you get to be around people that you probably aren't going to see on the weekends or in the evenings, right? So you get exposed to different nationalities. You get exposed to different economic situations. So it helps you understand. And that's why I believe it is a public good, right? That there is a benefit beyond the core academics, beyond learning to read and write. You know, there's always that old saying, or that poster used to be up, I learned everything I needed to know in life in kindergarten,
Well,
right?
there's some truth to that.
And there's reality to that. Because kindergarten is when you came in and you got to mix with a whole bunch of different people that you didn't know before, and you learned to get along. And you learned, sometimes you had a little fight, but then you had someone that, helps you get over that, and we moved forward together, and we supported each other's growth, and we played together on the playground, right? So there's so much good in reality and coming around and meeting people that you didn't know before and learning how to function together that I think happens in public education, that we don't get credit for that component of why it's important.
I think there's a incredible value in play.
Yeah.
And I hate seeing these young people glued to their iPads and their tablets and stuff, because they're really missing out on something that I think will make a big difference in how well they acclimate to different situations as they get older.
Social interaction matters, right?
Yes.
We've known that from day one, and it's a big part of, at least when we were running preschool programs when I was here, that was a core component, right? We wanted academics in our early childhood education, but we wanted play as a piece of that, because you learn so much through that experience.
Right.
And I don't think it ends at preschool, right? I think that needs to continue, right? And project-based learning was a big component of what we were trying to engage in. It allowed students to collaborate together, work on projects. And I would say that can be done digitally, right? Pieces of that can be done digitally, as I've got kids that are in college that are collaborating with people in different locations across the country because of digital tools that they never had an opportunity to before.
Right.
But it can't be the only way, right? You've got to have the physical interaction one-on-one, face-to-face, as well as the digital tools to engage in that way also.
Where do you come down on longer school terms?
I don't think it's a bad thing typically, and I think my proof is in my track record when I was leading in Springfield Public Schools that we expanded summer learning opportunities for kids because I thought those were beneficial to students. So we added a whole bunch of opportunities in June and a whole bunch of opportunities in July for kids to continue their learning throughout the summer. The summer slide is real, right? I mean, there is data that tells you
They
that.
forget a lot over the summer, don't they?
And especially, again, in lower SES environments, right, where students don't have as much support. They may not be going to a camp over the summer. They may not be at home with a parent or in some other educational programming opportunities. Going home for 2 to 3 months, the summer slide is real. It's documented.
Yes.
So giving more opportunities to continue learning in the summer, I think, is a benefit.
So let's talk about the pandemic. We had one. I don't know if you had heard that.
I recall slightly. I've tried to put it out of my memory. I do have a little PTSD from being a public leader during that time. But yeah, it's
So,
reality.
I can't think of anything that was more divisive about how to deal with that, mask or no mask. Yeah. You have a mission to educate kids. You also have a mission to protect their health. If they're not in school, in my view at least, they're not learning as well.
Right.
So what's the correct balance on those issues?
Yeah, I think impossible to know, right? So number one, none of us had ever been through it before. I don't think anybody that was leading in any way, shape, or form in our country had been through a pandemic. So we were all trying to learn from long time history past as well as what we had studied and known, right? And I think for school leaders, it became pretty clear that the number one priority for us always is student safety. Learning is a priority, but it doesn't matter if your students aren't safe or if we're going to lose students to some kind of illness. And students are only as successful as the staff. And I heard it a lot, weren't at high risk during the pandemic. And the data says that. They weren't at high risk during the pandemic, but staff were at high risk during the pandemic. So it became this coupling of how do we protect staff in order to serve students and come up with the best formula to protect all of our most valued assets and treasures, right? Our kids and our teachers and our educators and our support staff. And there was no perfect answer, right? So you had to go back to safety first and then go to the medical experts and follow their guidance. I had a doctorate in education, no idea exactly what it meant to have to deal with the things that were spreading in my school.
My sense, and if you disagree with me, that's great, but I felt like there were conflicting messages.
All the time. And we were put in... not just me, right, but school leaders, mayors, council members, right, commissioners, governors. I mean, it was all across all political and public service environments, put in very difficult positions to try to figure out how do we do this successfully. And, lots of mixed messages even from the medical fields of how best to do this, and shifting messages, right? So this was now, and then a month later,
good, masks don't make any difference.
Oh my gosh, there was no script, right? There was no transcript for this. All I could do at that time, and our team could do at that time, is do the best we could with the information that we had at the moment that we were making the decision that was necessary. Unfortunately, as you just said, those shifted over time, right? As we learned more, we did different. And as we came back to school, we, did different. And I'm glad we're past all of those phases. And I hope we've learned something from them so that if it happens again, we're more successful. But it was rough. It was rough on families. It was rough on kids. It was rough on leaders. It was really hard on teachers as they were trying to figure out how to serve their kids that they cared about.
Well, it's not going to be the last pandemic. There'll be
History tells
one.
us it will happen again.
It will happen again. And, it's like they say, a lot of generals are always fighting the last war. What have you learned about how you dealt with this that would hopefully help you address the issue more effectively in the future?
I think what you have to go back to is that we're going to make our decisions based on student health and listen to our student and staff health and safety, which I don't think that changed, right? I think that's consistent.
That's priority one.
I say that's priority one. And then number two, you're going to hope, right, that we have better clarity from the healthcare professionals, right, regarding on how to do that more successfully. And then I think we had certainly learned things about digital delivery and universal digital delivery and how hard it is, right? And we undoubtedly know that we want kids in our schools if at all possible, right? That I think was consistent before and it's consistent after. And if there's anything we can do to keep schools open and kids in our classrooms, we want to try to do that because that's the safety, the security that they need. That's where learning happens most routinely and predictably, right? When you put them in their homes with unpredictable environments and technology tools and teachers that haven't been trained in order to do so, it's not unexpected that we would get pretty unpredictable results at that point. So I think knowing all of that, we will fight every way possible to try to keep schools open, right, and teachers and educators connected in some way possible, using the safety measures that we think is acceptable at that time.
Something that's getting some currency these days, maybe you can tell our listeners what it is and why it's controversial: social emotional learning.
Yeah. I think that one kind of comes back down to me, and I honestly, I don't know why it's so controversial, because it comes back to that statement I made earlier about kindergarten, right? We've taught kids forever how to get along. We've taught kids forever how to take into consideration the feelings of others and the backgrounds of others and understand all of those things, because that's what creates a safe learning environment, right? And Maslow's hierarchy
of needs,
has been around for a long time, right? And it says if we can't take care of safety and those needs first, then learning isn't going to happen. In my mind, that's what SEL is, right? It's making sure that kids understand what it means to create a safe learning environment, how to respond when they're struggling, how to ask for supports, how to understand their peers, right? How to get along with your peers and your educators. And that is a core component of education since time began.
It seems to me that some people think or are concerned it's some kind of Trojan horse for another agenda.
It's not the boogeyman, right? It's not something that's hiding in the closet meant to take over and demonize compromise education or turn it into some political faction. I promise that's not what we were ever trying to accomplish in Springfield schools. We were trying to support kids to become better learners, right? And part of that is supporting their social and emotional needs.
Yeah.
And that's always been the case.
Yeah. So tell me what your thoughts are about the pros and cons of charter schools.
Yeah. Well, charter schools go way, way back in history, right? So they're not this new phenomenon. And I agree with what the principles that charter schools were built upon, and that was creating smaller incubator environments where you could try new practices out, be innovative, right? And try those in new ways, and try to then take the successful ones and deploy them back into traditional systems to move the needle.
That's kind of the notion of federalism in our whole federal government. Right. You got 50 states and 50 laboratories.
Right. We learn from each other, right? And that basis of charter is good. And you kind of see it actually reflected in Springfield, right? I mean, we have small little magnet schools that are built on creating new practices or trying innovative approaches in order to serve students, and then taking some of those approaches back to other schools and implementing those. So I like that aspect of charter. Where charter becomes harder for me to swallow is when it moves from collaboration to competition. Right? And I'm not a believer that competition's unhealthy, but competition for competition's sake without a component of infused, purposeful, intentional collaboration becomes harmful for kids, right? Because in Missouri, it's not that we have bad charters, we have a bad charter law. And that law was, in my mind, meant to dismantle, right, a couple school districts, right, on purpose, right, and it was a way to kind of break them. And there was no intentionality about learning best practice from others and then infusing those best practices into these schools, right? And then it became, right, just a competition for resources at that point instead of a collaboration. So no different than, unfortunately, accreditation systems can have that same effect, right? And that can be just your internal metric system in Springfield. If we had 35 elementaries, and if I ran that model purely on a competition model, rank and sort my elementaries and say, you're the good one and you're the bad one, and we're going to shut you down if you don't do good things, what are the odds of collaboration between those schools ever happening and learning best practices from each other? Very slim, right? You're gonna create your trade secrets and you're gonna hold them tight, right? You're not gonna share them with the one next door because I don't want to lose, right? And I think education's too important to play the game that way. It should be a collaborative effort, and that's what's good in charter if it's done well.
So let me be the devil's advocate for a moment.
Yeah.
If I can hear a proponent of charter schools, particularly, let's say, a private charter type school, saying, you guys, you overeducated educators are telling me what I can and what I can't do with my own kid.
Right.
And I think that, in the final analysis, should be my decision about where they go to school and who cares more about them than I do as a parent. And yet you guys are constantly throwing up roadblocks to frustrate my decision as a parent.
Right.
How would you respond to that?
And I would say your choices aren't completely limited. You always have your homeschool, your private options. You can choose those, right? But we believe in a public good where everybody needs to be successful. In order to do so, we have to create a system where we collaborate with each other and make everybody successful. And when you just have kids, right, and parents moving based on a recent test score or a recent, successful football team, right, or whatever the case might be, that doesn't create a great blueprint for success of how you create a good system. And I think my testament to them is we need consistency in our schools, right? And we need great teachers, and we need kids, and we need parents engaged. Every school can be successful, and you can still relocate and choose a different school or choose a different option, but just shuffling the deck, right, every year based on a recent test score or a whim of some sort is not going to be great for your kid, and it's not going to be great for the kids of Missouri.
My sense is a lot of what are imposed in terms of restriction requirements on public schools throughout the nation comes from the federal government. federal money's got strings tied to it. And I don't know, what is it typically, maybe as much as 10% of your budget?
Yeah, I was going to say it's about 10% on average across the country that would be tied to federal dollars.
So is it worth it?
Those are important dollars because, and what most people don't see is that they're isolated to just a few pockets of spending, right? And I wouldn't say that those strings control the majority of of a school, right? There's a whole bunch of requirements set by our state legislature that are much beyond what.
Well, isn't there a lot of federal testing requirements?
There are. There are some.
There
are some testing requirements, but other than the testing requirements, the money goes for special education, right? Versus Board for Special Education, which is a much needed asset and resource. It goes for food service programming for kids, and it goes for high poverty schools, right? So Title I, right, are the biggest allocations. So those are the dollars that flow in, right? And then they ask for regular testing at each grade level or whatever, in a couple content areas to see progress that the state administers. And then, they don't mandate the curriculum. They don't mandate, believe it or not, what you hear nationally is that's not what happens from the federal level. Those are state level decisions by our State Board of Education, and it's not curriculum, it's standards, right? And then at the local level, the curriculum is selected and built by educators. So I think schools have more flexibility to do more things than we often give them credit for, but we often point at, we can't do it because the Fed said so, or we can't do it because the state said so. One of the things that is real is the number of requirements and the number of expectations on schools has grown exponentially.
Well, I guess that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. A complaint made is, heck, we're not teaching these kids the way we want to teach them, but we're having to teach them to pass tests that they're imposed on us by the federal government.
Yeah. And there are elements of that, for sure, that high stakes testing and standardized testing has created, and that started really with NCLB, No Child Left Behind, is when it became the highest stakes testing environment, which anybody that was in education knew was going to be an epic failure. You can't mandate that all kids are going to be 100% proficient.
It's like Lake Wobegon, all our kids are above average.
I don't understand. And that was bipartisan, right? It's a great vision, it's a great hope, but that's not reality. You can't just say, hey, 10% a year, 7% a year, and by whatever the year is, and we'll make it happen, right? That discounts human nature and what we know about learning in all facets, right? So there are aspects that they control with some dollars and with some testing mandates, but I would hearken to say that more mandates have been put on by the state level in the last 10 to 20 years than they have been at the federal level. So each state has control over their education environment, and they get the Fed dollars, but they have a lot of opinions also about what should be done in their classrooms and what should happen every day too.
A lot of the more conservative people in Congress routinely say we should abolish the Department of Education.
Yep.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I think that's risky to throw the kind of the baby out with the bathwater kind of situation. I think, are there places they can get better? 100%. At the national and at the state level also, and at the local levels. We can all get better. But to abolish the things that they stand for, right, that I just talked about, their three number one funding streams seem like really important things to take care of.
Yeah.
Students with special needs, right? Students in high poverty environments, and students that don't have enough food. Right. I would hate to
come down against any of those.
I would hate to abolish the department that's in charge of making sure that those things happen. Right. And that's not to throw in that they do a lot of career and technical support also for career education, which is a huge important part of our, prep for the future for kids right now. So
one last question.
Sure.
We're seeing fewer boys enrolling in college.
Okay.
I think Cliff Smart, I interviewed him the other day, and he said 60% of his students are females. Yeah. And so there's a lot of young men that are just kind of dropping out. Mm-hmm. Do you have an opinion about why and what, if anything, can be done about that?
That's a great question, and I don't study higher ed to the level that I probably should know that. What I would tell you is in K-12, dropout rates have actually decreased, and we're graduating more kids and more at higher percentages.
Even between boys and girls, males and females?
I think it's growing on both sides. It's not declining on one and increasing on the other.
I see.
I certainly, if you study the data of, some of the academic data and you look at the top 10s, right, every year that come out, you do see female-dominated environments sometime, which is great that girls are being successful in schools, right? And pursuing careers and, going to college at a higher rate. And I think their retention rates, and I'm not going to quote Cliff, but I'm guessing their retention rate's pretty high too, because
I would think so.
They do very well in school, it appears to me. I think we do miss some ways to reach out to our boys in these environments and noting that they're a little different sometimes on how they want to be educated, or, maybe some more hands-on experiences for both sexes, right? I think there are opportunities to serve boys more successfully, but we're going to have to think about forming relationships deeper with them. That's what the basis of any education is, learning to know what they're passionate about, finding a topic and not just, mandating this. And a traditional curriculum is fine, but without experiences, without job, without enticing them about what the future holds for them and connecting it to relevance, I think they struggle sometimes. And I think we can do a better job of that.
John, I want to thank you for being my guest today on In Our Town.
It was a pleasure to be here.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.